"Ma'am, I need you to sit down. Something's wrong with your pilots." Two unconscious men. A cockpit filling with something that smelled like an electrical fire. And 141 strangers who had no idea the quiet woman in seat 14C used to fly fighter jets nobody was allowed to talk about. She hadn't touched the controls of this aircraft in her life. She strapped in anyway. Radio's dead. Autopilot fighting a slow, uncommanded drift toward the ground. And somewhere far below, a name about to hit an emergency frequency that would stop two combat pilots cold, mid-sentence, on an open channel. Because the woman flying that plane wasn't just a retired officer. She was the reason her own father died 7 years ago and didn't know it yet. What she uncovers in the hours after that landing doesn't just save 141 lives. It reopens a case the United States Air Force spent 7 years trying to keep buried forever. Fort Callahan Air National Guard Base does not exist on any map you can buy at a gas station. Neither does Ridgeview, Colorado. Neither does the airline in this story, or the aircraft tail number, or the report that gets filed 7 months later with a stamp that says close. This is a work of fiction. Every name, every base, every call sign belongs to no one but the story itself. Two fighter jets go dark on the radio, the second her name hits the frequency. Not static, not a bad connection. Silence. The kind that comes from two trained killers forgetting for 1 full second how to speak. Because the name isn't a name. Not to them. It's a legend nobody was supposed to meet in real life. And she's sitting in a cockpit that isn't hers, flying a plane she was never trained on, with 141 strangers behind her, who have no idea the woman keeping them alive used to have a different job, a darker one. One with no name at all for 6 of the years she did it. Before we get into how she got there, comment where you're watching from. Hit subscribe. Because what happens to her family before this flight even started is worse than anything that happens in the sky. Vivian Marsh had not cried in 4 years. She would have told you that if you'd asked, which nobody did. Because nobody on Concourse B at 6 in the morning asks a woman in a navy blazer whether she's cried recently. They ask if the gates changed. They ask if this is the line for boarding group 2. They do not ask the quiet ones anything at all, which was fine. Which was exactly how she liked it. 45 years old. Dark hair pulled back so tight, it looked less like a hairstyle and more like a decision. A duffel bag at her feet instead of a rolling suitcase. Because rolling suitcases made noise on tile floors, and Vivian Marsh had spent 19 years learning to move through the world without announcing herself first. Habits like that don't retire. Not even when you do. She'd handed in her flight suit 8 months ago. Signed the paperwork, shook 3 hands that mattered and about 40 that didn't, walked out of a building she'd walked into as a 23-year-old lieutenant who thought she understood what fear was. She hadn't. Not back then. Fear, real fear, the kind that lives in your chest like a second heartbeat that came later. That came the year her father died and nobody would tell her why. The gate agent called her Roe. Vivian didn't move yet. She was watching a family near the window, a mother wrangling a stroller, a father balancing 2 coffees and a diaper bag, a toddler shrieking with the particular delight only very small children feel about airports. Ordinary chaos, ordinary love worn on the outside where everyone could see it. She used to have that. Not the stroller. The ordinary part. Except ordinary had never really been hers to keep. Not since the day a man in a dress uniform came to her front door with a folder he wouldn't let her open until he was sitting down, like the news needed a chair under it, like standing up to hear it might break something in the floor. Her father, Colonel Thomas Marsh, 19 years her senior in the same uniform, same wings, same stubborn refusal to explain himself when it mattered most, dead in what the official report called a training incident. 7 years ago now. 7 years, and the word incident still sat in her mouth like a stone she'd swallowed and never quite passed. Because a training incident doesn't seal its own file in 11 days. A training incident doesn't get investigated by 3 different officers who each, independently, requested reassignment within a year. A training incident doesn't leave a daughter standing in a hallway at 2 a.m. years later, still still running her thumb over the edge of a folded flag, like the answer might be hiding in the stitching. She'd asked questions. Of course she had. Every question came back the same. Closed. Classified. Above your clearance, Colonel, even though she outranked half the people telling her that by the time she asked the last time. So she stopped asking. Not because she stopped wanting to know. Because wanting to know had started costing her things. She couldn't afford to lose a promotion delayed. For no stated reason. A transfer she hadn't requested. A commanding officer who once looked at her across a briefing table with something that wasn't quite a warning, but wasn't far from one either. Let it go, Marsh, he'd said. Some doors don't open twice. She'd let it go. On the outside. On the inside, it had just gone quiet. Which isn't the same thing. Which is worse, actually, because quiet things don't heal. They just wait. Now boarding all remaining passengers for Flight 619 to Chicago, her flight. Her sister, Renee, who still lived 3 hours from where they grew up, and who had asked gently, the way people ask things they already suspect the answer to, whether Vivian was doing okay out there, alone, in an apartment with government-issue furniture, and no photographs on the walls except the one of their father in his flight suit, squinting into a sun that had set a long time ago. I'm fine, Vivian always said. She'd said it so many times it had started to sound true even to her. She boarded, found 14C, stowed the duffel under the seat in front of her. Instead of the overhead bin, an old habit, keep your gear where your hands can reach it fast, and looped the strap once around her ankle without thinking about why. Some habits you keep because you chose them. Some you keep because your body chose them for you a long time ago, and never checked back in to ask permission. The man next to her, 14B, introduced himself before the seatbelt sign had even lit. Grant Ferris, he said, extending a hand like they were at a networking mixer, instead of 31,000 feet from being strangers forever. Regional sales. You headed to Chicago for business? Something like that. He nodded like that was a full sentence, which for her it usually was. What do you do? I used to fly. Oh, like private jets? Charter stuff? Something like that. She watched the words land and do exactly what she wanted them to do. Close a door. Gently. Firmly. The particular skill of a woman who had spent 2 decades learning how to say almost nothing and have it sound like an answer. Grant Ferris, 40 years old, good at reading rooms in sales meetings, understood he wasn't getting past that door. He let it drop, turned to his phone, didn't try again, which suited her fine. Because the truth, the actual truth, the one that lived somewhere under her sternum where she kept things she didn't hand out to strangers on airplanes, the truth was too big for small talk anyway. The truth had a name that wasn't Vivian Marsh, not in certain rooms, not among certain people. The truth was that for 6 of her 19 years, she had flown missions that didn't exist on paper, solo intercepts over airspace that didn't officially have anyone in it. A night that still visited her sometimes at 3 a.m. An engine gone. 400 miles of black ocean under a canopy she wasn't sure would hold, and a decision made in about 4 seconds that every instructor who ever taught her would have called reckless, and every instructor who ever taught her would also, quietly, have made the same call. She'd survived it, brought the jet home on fumes and stubbornness, and when the debrief was over, her squadron commander had looked at her the way you look at someone you've just watched do something that shouldn't have been possible, and said the thing that followed her out of every room for the rest of her career. The thing about Ghost is, you never know she's in the fight until the fight's already over. Nobody on this plane knew that name. Grant Ferris didn't know it. The toddler 2 rows back, kicking the seat in front of her, didn't know it. The flight attendants moving down the aisle with their little cart of ice and stale pretzels didn't know it. For the next hour, that was exactly how she wanted it to stay. It didn't stay that way. It started the way these things always start. Small, deniable, a thing your body notices before your mind agrees to. 6:52 in the morning. 38 minutes into the flight. Somewhere over a stretch of Midwestern sky, the color of an old bruise, Vivian felt the cabin pressure shift, a whisper of a change. The kind most of the 140 passengers around her would file under ears popping and forget within 10 seconds. Her body didn't forget. Her body had felt pressure changes like this 1,000 times in cockpits, where a fraction of a shift meant something structural was wrong, and it reacted before her conscious mind had finished catching up. She set down the magazine she hadn't actually been reading, sat up straighter, listened. Because that's the thing, nobody tells you about training that deep, that long. It doesn't turn off. It doesn't know the difference between a cockpit with your name on the canopy and a coach seat with a stranger's elbow on the armrest. It just watches, all the time waiting for the moment it's needed. The nose of the plane dipped, gentle, almost polite, but unmistakable. Then the intercom crackled. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking. We're experiencing..." A pause. Too long a pause. The kind of pause that has weight to it, that you can feel pressing down on the cabin like a held breath. A technical issue in the cockpit. "We're going to begin a precautionary descent. Please remain seated with your belts fastened." Grant Ferris looked over at her. Half a smile. The nervous kind people give strangers when they want to be told it's nothing. She didn't give it to him. She was listening. Past his voice. Past the toddler's shriek 2 rows back. Past the low murmur of 140 people deciding, collectively, not to panic yet. She was listening to the engines. To a faint asymmetry in their tone. A sound a civilian ear would never register. A sound hers had been trained on since she was 22 years old, and every instructor she'd ever had told her the same thing. Trust the sound before you trust the instrument. The instrument lies sometimes. The sound doesn't. 30 seconds later, the intercom clicked back on. No words this time. A wet, rasping cough. Then the click of the channel going dead. Vivian's seatbelt was already undone. She didn't remember deciding that. Her hands had simply done it. The way hands do things after 19 years of training has rewired what the word decide even means. A flight attendant near the front, young, name tag reading. Corey stepped into the aisle with a hand raised. "Ma'am, I need you to sit down. We're asking everyone to. Something's wrong with your pilots." Her voice wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. There's a register some voices hit that doesn't require volume. Just certainty. "I can't let you. I flew fighters for 19 years. I've got more hours in the air than you've had on this earth. If I'm wrong about what I just heard, write me up after we land. If I'm right, you're about to need someone up there who knows what they're doing. And right now, that's me." Corey looked at her. 1 second. 2. Long enough to register something that read as authority, not hysteria. Long enough to understand that whatever was happening in this woman's chest, it wasn't panic. It was the opposite of panic. It was a switch flipping somewhere very old, very deep, and very calm. He moved. Keyed open the cockpit door with the emergency code, hands not quite steady, and stepped back to let her through. What was waiting on the other side would end up, months later, inside a report that ran to 61 pages and used exactly one word to describe what happened next. Exemplary. In the moment, all Vivian knew was 2 men slumped in their harnesses. Unconscious. One with his head tipped forward against the chest strap like his body had simply stopped being asked to hold itself up. The other with a hand still loosely curled around the yoke, as if some part of him hadn't gotten the message yet that the rest of him was gone. The cockpit smelled faintly sweet, sickly sweet, like an electrical short tangled up with hot cooking oil. "Get them oxygen," she said, already sliding into the captain's seat, unbuckling his harness, easing him back to make room. Full masks. Not the drop-down bags. The crew masks, side panel, 100%. And get everyone in the cabin masked up too. If the air smells like anything back there, I need it off this plane system. Corey went. Another attendant appeared a moment later. Older. Priya, according to the tag, 22 years flying, and a face that had seen exactly one thing in her career that came close to this. Do you know how to?" "I flew F-22s for the Air Force. I can fly this. I need you to help me get him strapped somewhere safe, and I need someone checking his breathing every 60 seconds. Priya moved. Vivian's hands were already crossing the instrument panel. Not searching. Finding. The particular economy of motion that only comes from a body that has done a version of this 1,000 times, even if it's never sat in exactly this seat before. Altitude. Airspeed, heading, autopilot status, fuel state 4 seconds. That's all it took. The autopilot was still engaged. That was the only mercy in the entire situation. Whoever had been sitting in this seat, in the last conscious moment before the fumes took him, had at least not disengaged it. They were descending in a slow, uncommanded drift, the autostation doing its clumsy best to correct without anyone telling it where to go. Vivian reached for the radio. Frontier 619 declaring an emergency. Both pilots incapacitated. Suspected fume event. I am a passenger, former U.S. Air Force fighter pilot, currently at the controls. Request immediate vectors to nearest suitable airport. Silence. She tried again. Nothing. A glance at the panel told her why. Half the comm suite was throwing fault codes. Whatever had come with the fumes had reached further than just the two men's lungs. She switched frequencies. Tried the emergency channel. Tried a third one she remembered from another life, one she'd used exactly twice before, both times in situations that were never supposed to be spoken about again. Static, and once a fragment of someone else's transmission, too garbled to make out. For the first time since she'd walked through that door, something that wasn't quite fear, but stood close enough to touch it, moved through her chest. Not for herself. She'd made her peace with her own mortality a long time ago. Somewhere over open water with one engine gone and a canopy she wasn't sure would hold. Pilots who fly the edges of survivable eventually have to make that peace, or they don't last. This was different. Behind her, on the other side of a door thinner than it had any right to be, sat 141 people who had no idea their lives now depended on a stranger they'd never have picked out of a crowd, in an airplane she'd never flown, with a radio that didn't work, and no one on the other end to hear it if it did. She thought just for a second, just a flicker of the name she'd carried for 6 years. The one she never explained. The one that came from a mission so deep into contested airspace that the debrief afterward couldn't find a single radar return, proving she'd ever been there at all. Ghost. Her old squadron commander's voice, somewhere in the back of her mind, the way it always was in moments like this. The thing about Ghost is you never know she's in the fight until the fight's already over. No one on this plane knew that name. No one needed to. What they needed was steady hands. Hers were. She keyed the transponder to 7,700. The emergency squawk. The one code every pilot on Earth is trained to recognize instantly, the one that turns a blip on a radar screen from routine traffic into pay attention now. Something is very wrong. She had no way to know if anyone was seeing it. She sent it up anyway, into a sky that gave no answer back, 200 miles northeast, at a base whose runway lights were just beginning to click off with the coming sunrise. A radar controller named Staff Sergeant Danny Okafor watched a transponder code light up his scope that he had only ever seen in training simulations. Sir, I've got a 7700 squawk. Commercial heavy. No radio contact. 6,000 below assigned altitude and drifting. The duty officer was at his shoulder in 4 seconds. Frontier 619. That's the one. Get me the sector controller on the line. Scramble the alert flight. Now, 2 F-22 Raptors sat on 15-minute alert at the far end of the flight line. A standing posture left over from years of homeland readiness that most days meant nothing happened at all. Today it meant 2 pilots, Major Derek Boone, callsign Havoc, and Captain Sarah Denholm, callsign Ice, sprinting across tarmac still wet with morning dew, suited and airborne in under 6 minutes, because 141 people were on a plane that wasn't answering anyone. Talk to me, Havoc said, jet climbing, afterburners tucking away as he leveled his climb rate. Frontier 619, out of Ridgeview, bound for Chicago. Lost comms about 11 minutes ago. Squawking 7700. Last known altitude 25,000 and holding. Holding? I thought they were descending. They were. Now they've leveled off. Ice's voice cut in, sharper now. On autopilot they'd keep drifting unless somebody's flying it. Copy that. We don't know who or what's up there. Intercept and report. The Raptors closed the distance in under 9 minutes. Engines built for combat, doing the strange, almost mundane work of catching up to a wounded airliner. When they finally slid into formation off the wingtips, Havoc high and slightly aft on the left, ice mirroring on the right, both pilots got their first look at what they'd been sent to find. The plane was flying, not drifting, not wallowing in the slow, uncommanded wander of an aircraft with no one minding it, banking gently to correct heading, holding altitude within what looked like 50 feet. Small, precise inputs, the kind that told a trained eye somebody competent was up there, actively managing the aircraft, not just riding it downhill and hoping. Havoc, you seeing this? Yeah, I see it. Whoever's flying that thing is flying it. He eased his Raptor in close enough to get eyes into the cockpit windows, a maneuver no training manual would ever call anything but reckless, and in this exact moment was simply necessary. Through the glass for half a second, he caught the shape of someone in the captain's seat, hands on the yoke, head moving in the steady scan pattern of a person checking instruments, not the frozen posture of a panicked amateur. "I've got one person up front," he radioed back. "Doesn't look like a pilot in uniform. But whoever it is knows exactly what they're doing. This is not somebody flying scared." Back on the ground, an air traffic controller named Angela Reyes had finally managed to raise a weak, static-choked transmission on a backup frequency. Vivian, cycling through every channel she had left, had stumbled onto one that partially worked. 619. "I say, again, both crew incapacitated. I am a passenger, retired Air Force pilot. I need static," swallowed the rest. "Say again your last. You're broken and unreadable." Static, then clearer, because Vivian had finally found the strongest patch of signal she was going to get. "Denver, I mean, ground control, 619. I need vectors to the nearest airport with a runway long enough for this aircraft. I have 2 fighters off my wing right now. If you can talk to them, have them relay for me. My radios are failing." Angela's hands were already moving. "Copy that, 619, standby." She switched frequencies. "Havoc, ICE, can you relay for 619? Her radios are degraded." "Copy ground. We've got a solid link on guard frequency, go ahead." And so it went. For the next 11 minutes, a woman flying an airliner she had never trained on, with 2 fighter jets riding shotgun off her wingtips as her only working communication relay, talked her way toward the nearest field rated for a plane this size. Fort Callahan's own strip, cleared and waiting. Havoc read her the runway length, wind conditions, emergency services status. All of it passed hand to hand through a relay chain that would later be described, in the driest possible federal language, as an improvised but effective communications workaround under extreme circumstances. What that language could never quite capture was the particular quality of silence that settled over the 2 fighter pilots' internal channel once they understood what they were actually watching. "Ground, be advised," I said at one point, quieter now, mostly just to Havoc. She just briefed a single-engine go-around scenario on the relay like it was nothing. Full contingency plan in an aircraft she's never flown. "Yeah," Havoc said. "I heard it too." Vivian did not know, as she configured the aircraft for landing flaps, extending in careful stages, gear dropping with its 3 reassuring green lights, speed bleeding off exactly where she wanted it, that 30,000 feet below, and 8 minutes out, someone in Fort Callahan's tower had already cleared every other aircraft from the pattern and rolled every fire truck on the field to standby positions. She did not know that in a ready room back at that base, pilots with no assignment to this mission were clustered around a radio feed, listening to a relay chain most of them had never heard used quite this way before. She knew only what a pilot in her seat needed to know: airspeed, altitude, heading. The growing shape of a runway on the horizon that represented the only chance 141 strangers had of walking away from this morning. She flew the approach the way she used to fly approaches, to carrier decks in weather that grounded lesser pilots, not with tension, with a kind of total narrowed presence that left no room in her mind for anything except the next 3 seconds. And the 3 seconds after that: wind correction, glide path, speed. The runway grew from a strip on the horizon to a wide gray ribbon rushing up to meet her. At 200 feet she began the flare, nose easing up, weight settling toward the ground the way she'd learned to feel it in machines that behaved nothing like this one. The main gear touched with a small, solid chirp. Not hard, not soft. Just correct, the kind of landing a passenger might not even register as anything but routine. She had the reversers out and the brakes working before the nose gear had fully settled. Working the aircraft down the runway with both hands and both feet, no co-pilot to split the load with, doing every job herself the way she had 100 times before in machines built for exactly one person and never in something this size. When the plane finally rolled to a stop, 3/4 of the way down the runway, surrounded within seconds by a convoy of flashing emergency lights, Vivian Marsh sat in the captain's chair for exactly 4 seconds, with her hands still on the controls, and let herself breathe. Then she got up, because there were 2 unconscious pilots who needed paramedics, and 139 passengers who needed to know it was over. None of that stopped just because her part of it was done. Havoc and Ice held a slow racetrack pattern above the field until the last passenger cleared the evacuation slides, watching a scene unfold below them that neither pilot would fully describe to anyone outside their squadron for weeks, because there wasn't really a way to describe it that didn't sound like exaggeration. Only when the tower released them did they turn back toward base. It was on that flight home, somewhere over gray morning sky, that Havoc finally keyed his radio to the internal squadron frequency. Ops, Havoc, requesting a name on that passenger who had the airplane. Wanted in the after action. It took 40 minutes for someone at the base to come back with an answer, because it required a records pull that crossed into databases most duty officers didn't have routine access to, and because when the name finally came back, the duty officer on the other end read it twice before saying it out loud. Havoc, be advised. Passenger's name is Vivian Marsh. Lieutenant Colonel, retired, United States Air Force. Copy. Anything else on her? A pause. Long enough that Havoc thought the transmission had dropped. Havoc, her call sign's in here. Go ahead. It's Ghost. For a moment, nobody on the frequency said anything at all. It was Ice who finally broke it, and when she did, her voice carried a different weight than it had all morning. The Ghost. Marsh. The one who brought a Raptor back over 400 miles of open water on one engine and a canopy that shouldn't have held. That's the one, the duty officer said. 6 years flying missions most of us aren't cleared to hear about. Half of overwater emergency protocol got rewritten because of what she survived. Guys who trained under her still talk about her like she's. He stopped, searching for a word and not quite finding it. Like she's not entirely real. Havoc looked out through his canopy at the pale morning sky, thinking about a woman he'd glimpsed for half a second through a cockpit window, sitting in a captain's seat that wasn't hers, running a full contingency briefing over a broken radio relay like it was the easiest thing in the world. She's real, he said quietly. I just watched her. Silence again on the frequency. Different this time. Not shock. Something closer to reverence. If fighter pilots ever allowed themselves anything that soft out loud. Down on the ground, Vivian Marsh had no idea that a name she'd spent 8 months trying to leave behind had just found her again. 31,000 feet above a state she'd never planned to stop in an airplane that was never supposed to need her. She had wanted, more than anything, to be an unremarkable woman in a window seat, done with the weight of always being the one who had to be extraordinary. But some part of her, the part that had never fully believed her father's death was the accident everyone told her to accept, had also learned a long time ago that the world rarely lets you put a thing like that down for good. It just waits, sometimes for years, and then it finds you again at 31,000 feet, in an airplane that isn't yours, and asks you to be exactly who you always were, whether you were ready or not. She stepped off the aircraft in Fort Callahan, into a wall of flashing lights, and shouted instructions and paramedics rushing toward the cockpit door she'd just walked out of. Somebody wrapped a blanket around her shoulders even though it wasn't cold. Somebody else was already asking her name into a clipboard, and she gave it flat, factual. No more emotion in it than she'd give a customs officer, while behind her, the 2 unconscious pilots were carried out on stretchers. Oxygen masks still fitted over their faces, both of them, as far as anyone could tell in that first chaotic hour, going to live. That was the only part that mattered to her in that moment. Everyone was going to live. She didn't know yet what it was going to cost her to make sure of that. She didn't know that somewhere in a hangar on this same base, a mechanic with graying hair and hands that shook slightly, these days was about to hear her name over a radio scanner. He kept on out of habit, more than 30 years after he'd first heard it, attached to a different marsh entirely. A colonel. A man who had died 7 years ago in a training incident that Gus Pruitt had never once, not for a single day since, believed was an accident. She didn't know that 400 miles away, in an office with a view of a runway he hadn't personally flown from in over a decade, a man named Roland Whitcomb was about to see the same name cross a report on his desk and feel something cold move down the back of his neck that he would spend the rest of the day trying to convince himself was nothing. All Vivian Marsh knew, standing on that tarmac with a blanket she didn't need wrapped around shoulders that had just saved 141 lives, was that she wanted to call her sister, hear Renee's voice, tell her she was okay before the news beat her to it. She reached into her jacket for her phone. Her hand was shaking. She hadn't noticed that until just now. 19 years of training, and nobody had ever quite prepared her for the strange, delayed arrival of fear, the way it doesn't show up when you need your hands steady, only after, when there's nothing left to do but feel it. She dialed. It rang twice. Viv? Renee's voice already tight with worry, the news apparently faster than either of them expected. Oh my God, Viv. Are you? I just saw something on the news. A flight out of Ridgeview. They said, I'm okay. Vivian said, Renee, I'm okay. I'm on the ground. A sound on the other end that wasn't quite words, just breath, released all at once. The sound of someone who had spent the last 10 minutes rehearsing the worst phone call of her life and being handed a different one instead. They're saying a passenger landed the plane, Renee said when she could speak again. They're saying, Viv, was that you? Please tell me that wasn't. Vivian closed her eyes, watched the red and blue lights strobe against the inside of her eyelids. It was me. Silence on the line. A long one. Of course it was, Renee finally said, and there was something in her voice now that was half exasperation and half a kind of aching, exhausted pride. Of course it was you. Only my sister boards a normal flight to visit her family and ends up saving the entire plane. I didn't have a choice. You never do, Renee said quietly. That's kind of the problem, Viv. You never think you have a choice. You just become the person the moment needs. Every single time. Even when nobody's asking you to. Vivian didn't answer that. Because there wasn't an answer that wouldn't lead somewhere she wasn't ready to go yet. Somewhere that started with their father's name and ended somewhere she still didn't fully understand. 7 years and 100 unanswered questions later. Just get here, Renee said instead. Whenever you can. I don't care how late. I'll leave the porch light on, I will. She hung up. Stood there a moment longer, watching paramedics wheel the second stretcher toward a waiting ambulance, watching passengers cluster in stunned, grateful knots on the tarmac, some of them crying, some of them already pulling out phones to call people they loved. A young airman jogged up to her, breathless, clipboard in hand. Ma'am, Lieutenant Colonel Marsh, Base Command is requesting you come inside. He hesitated, glancing back over his shoulder, like he wasn't quite sure he was allowed to say the next part. There's already a call-in from a Major Boone. He wants to speak with you personally. Vivian felt something tighten behind her ribs, a small, cold recognition she couldn't yet name. Havoc, she said. The airman blinked. Ma'am? Nothing. Lead the way. She followed him across the tarmac, duffel bag still looped once around her wrist, out of the same old habit that had never once, in 19 years, let her walk away from a plane without her gear in reach. She had no way of knowing. Walking through those hangar doors into fluorescent light, and the low murmur of a dozen conversations that all seemed to stop, briefly, the moment she entered, she had no way of knowing that her name was already moving through radio frequencies and ready rooms 4 states away. That a lieutenant colonel named Marcus Webb, at a fighter wing she hadn't thought about in years, was about to get a text message that would stop him mid-sentence in a Tuesday morning briefing. That pilots who had never met her were about to hear a story that would follow her for the rest of her life, whether she wanted it to or not. She had no way of knowing that somewhere in a records office on this very base, a records pull attached to her name had just triggered a quiet, automatic flag in a database that had nothing to do with today's flight at all. A flag connected to a case 7 years old, a case with her father's name on it, a case that had been closed officially for 6 years and 11 months. All she knew, walking into that hangar with her hands finally starting to steady, was that something had shifted today. Something bigger than one flight, one emergency, one impossible landing. She just didn't know yet how far back it went, or how far it still had left to go, because the plane was on the ground now. Safe, solid, real. But some things, once they start moving, don't stop just because you've landed. They're only getting started. Fort Callahan does not exist. Neither does Ridgeview, nor the airline in this story, nor any officer, base, or agency named in the pages that follow. This is a work of fiction, built to honor real courage without claiming a single real name. The first photograph hit the internet before Vivian Marsh had even changed out of her flight clothes. Somebody on the tarmac, a phone held low, half hidden, the way people do it now when they know they're not supposed to but do it anyway. Blurry, grainy. A woman in a navy blazer walking toward a hangar with a duffel bag looped around her wrist and her face turned slightly away from the light. By the time she'd showered in a base guest quarters that smelled like industrial soap and old carpet, the photo had 40,000 shares. By morning, it had 400,000, because that's the thing about a story like this. It doesn't need her permission to grow. It doesn't need her name, not at first. It just needs one word pilot attached to one word miracle, and the internet does the rest, stitching a legend together out of secondhand quotes and speculation. And 141 passengers who couldn't stop talking about the woman who saved their lives. She woke at 5, out of habit, in a room that wasn't hers, in a building she hadn't set foot in for 8 months. And for one disorienting second, lying there in the gray pre-dawn light, she forgot. Forgot the plane. Forgot the landing. Forgot the blanket someone had wrapped around her shoulders like she was something fragile, instead of something that had just held 141 lives together with her bare hands. Then it came back, all of it, at once, and underneath it, quieter, older, a second weight she hadn't expected to feel yet. Her father's face, not the photograph on her wall, the real one, the one from the last time she saw him alive, standing on a different tarmac entirely, 7 years and a lifetime ago, squinting into a sun that had no idea it was about to set on him for good. She didn't know yet why that memory had surfaced. Not really. She would. Soon enough. Her phone was already lighting up on the nightstand when she reached for it. 41 missed calls. Voicemails from numbers she didn't recognize. A text from Renee that just said, "Call me when you can. I love you. I'm not going anywhere." And one message that made her sit up straight in the dark. It came from a number she hadn't seen in 8 months. A number she'd deleted, actually, the week she processed out. Except apparently deleting a number doesn't delete the person who used to call it. Marcus Webb heard, "Are you okay? Call me when you can. Not urgent. Just call me." She stared at that message longer than it deserved, because Marcus Webb didn't send not urgent messages. In 19 years, she'd never once known him to type a word he didn't mean exactly, which meant something was urgent enough that he'd felt the need to lie about it. She didn't call him back yet. Not yet. First, there was a base commander to speak with, an investigator from something called the National Aviation Safety Board, a stack of forms with her name typed at the top, in a font that made her feel less like a person and more like a case file. Which, she was starting to understand, was exactly what she'd become. The investigator was a woman named Denise Okonkwo, mid-50s, reading glasses pushed up into gray-streaked hair, a voice that had clearly done this exact interview 1,000 times and had learned somewhere along the way not to waste time being gentle about it. Lieutenant Colonel Marsh. She didn't look up from her folder right away. Retired 8 months ago. a 19 years of service. F-22 pilot. That's right. You understand this interview is being recorded? I do. Okonkwo finally looked up. Something in her face shifted, not quite surprise, more like recalibration. The gap between the file on the table and the woman sitting across from it. Walk me through the moment you first suspected something was wrong. So Vivian did. Flat, factual. The way she'd been trained to give a debrief since she was 23 years old. Strip out the fear. Strip out the adrenaline. Give them only what happened, in the order it happened, because feelings didn't help anyone reconstruct a timeline. Okonkwo listened without interrupting. Wrote almost nothing down, which somehow felt worse than if she'd been scribbling frantically. When Vivian finished, Okonkwo sat back, tapped her pen once against the folder. The maintenance logs on that aircraft show a heat exchanger replacement 14 months ago. Standard part. Standard vendor. A pause. Except the failure signature doesn't match a standard heat exchanger crack. Not exactly. Vivian felt something in her chest go very still. What does it match? Okonkwo studied her for a moment before answering. The kind of look that measures how much a person can be told versus how much they're about to go find out on their own anyway. I can't discuss an open investigation with a witness. You understand that? I do, but... Okonkwo closed the folder. Slower than she needed to. You flew fighters for 19 years. You know what a normal component failure looks like versus one that doesn't quite add up. I imagine you already have your own opinion about which one this is. She didn't say anything else. Didn't need to. Vivian sat there a long moment after Okonkwo left the room, staring at the closed door, feeling something cold uncoil low in her stomach. Because she did have an opinion. She'd had it since the moment she saw the fault codes cascading across that instrument panel 31,000 feet over Nebraska sky, and she'd been pushing it down ever since, telling herself it was exhaustion, adrenaline, the mind reaching for patterns where there weren't any, the way minds do after trauma. Except that word kept showing up in her thoughts uninvited, the way it always did when some part of her already knew something the rest of her wasn't ready to admit yet. Except she'd seen a failure signature like that before. Not on this aircraft. Not this year. 7 years ago. In a report she'd fought for 6 months to get even a partial glimpse of. A report with her father's name at the top and the word closed stamped across the bottom in red ink that had never once in 7 years stopped looking wrong to her. She reached for her phone. Called Marcus Webb. He picked up before the first ring finished. Viv, just her name. No hello. The particular economy of a man who'd known her for 15 years and had never once wasted a word on her that didn't need saying. You said not urgent. I lied, I figured. A pause on the line. She could hear him exhale, somewhere 4 states away, in an office she'd been in maybe a dozen times over the years, always for reasons that felt small at the time and looked enormous in hindsight now. I need to see you in person, he said. Not on a call. Not on a base where every hallway has ears. Marcus, Viv. His voice dropped, quiet and careful in a way that made the back of her neck prickle. Somebody pulled your father's file this morning, about 4 hours after your name hit the wire services. I don't think that's a coincidence, and neither do you. Not really. She closed her eyes, because she'd known. Some part of her had known the second Okonkwo mentioned that failure signature. Had known before that. Actually had known the moment she watched those fault codes scroll across a panel 31,000 feet in the air and felt something horribly, impossibly familiar move through her chest. Where, she said. Not a question. Just 2 syllables, flat and certain, the voice of a woman who already knew she was about to walk back into a fight she'd spent 7 years trying to convince herself was over. There's a diner. Off Route 9, about 40 minutes from the base. Nobody from the wing eats there. That's the point. Tonight. She hung up, sat there, in the borrowed quiet of a guest room that wasn't hers, staring at a phone screen that had already accumulated another dozen missed calls in the 4 minutes she'd been talking to Marcus. And underneath all of it, underneath the noise, the cameras, the investigators, the world suddenly, violently interested in a woman who had spent 8 months trying to disappear. One thought kept circling back. Small, quiet, insistent. Her father used to say something, once, near the end, something she hadn't understood at the time, and had spent 7 years turning over in her mind like a stone she couldn't quite skip. Some things don't stay buried because they're forgotten, Vivian. They stay buried because somebody's paying to keep the dirt on top. She hadn't known what he meant. She was starting to. The diner off Route 9 had a name that had faded so badly on its sign you had to already know what it said to read it. Red vinyl booths cracked at the seams. A waitress who called everyone honey and didn't ask questions about the 2 people who slid into that back coupe at 9 at night and ordered coffee neither of them touched. Marcus Webb looked older than she remembered. Not in the 8 months since she'd seen him last longer than that. Like something had been wearing him down slow and steady for years, and today had simply been the day it finally showed. "You look terrible," she said, because it was true, and because it was easier than saying anything real yet. "Rough week." He wrapped both hands around a coffee cup he wasn't drinking. "Gets rougher when your call sign hits every major network by lunchtime. I didn't ask for any of this, I know." He looked at her then, really looked, the way people do, when they're about to say something they've been holding on to for longer than is comfortable. "I know you didn't, Viv. That's exactly why I need you to hear the rest of this before you walk back into that base tomorrow and start asking questions out loud." Her stomach tightened. "Marcus, what is it?" He was quiet for a long moment, turning the coffee cup slowly on its saucer, like he was deciding, even now, how much of this he was allowed to say. "Your father," he finally said, "was building a file. In the last year before he died. Not officially. Off the books. I only know because I was his exec officer for 8 months, and I watched him do it, and I never told anyone because he asked me not to, and because his jaw tightened, because after he died, telling anyone stopped feeling like the safe choice." Vivian's hands had gone very still on the table. "Building a file on what? Parts." Marcus said the word like it cost him something. "Aircraft components." Coming through a supplier that had won a maintenance contract 2 years earlier, undercutting every competitor by a margin nobody could quite explain. Your father started noticing failure rates that didn't match the manufacturer's data. Started pulling maintenance records, cross-referencing them against incident reports across 3 different bases. And he found a pattern. Marcus's voice dropped lower, even though the diner was nearly empty. A pattern that traced back to one supplier, one contract, one man who'd signed off on that contract, despite 2 junior officers flagging concerns during the bidding process. Vivian felt the diner tilt very slightly around her, the way a cockpit tilts in the half-second before your inner ear catches up to what your instruments already know. "Who?" Marcus looked at her for a long moment before he said it. "Roland Whitcomb." The name landed like something physical. A weight dropped directly onto her chest, because she knew that name. Everyone in her old world knew that name, Brigadier General Roland Whitcomb, base commander during 3 of her deployment cycles, a man whose signature she'd seen on more citations and evaluations than she could count. A man who had, in fact, personally recommended her for the assignment that eventually earned her the call sign Ghost. A man she had trusted, or thought she had, in the particular complicated way you trust someone whose approval shapes your entire career. "That's not possible," she heard herself say, even as some older, colder part of her recognized that it was exactly, precisely possible. That it explained things she'd spent 7 years failing to explain any other way. "Your father thought the same thing at first," Marcus said quietly. "That's why it took him almost a year to build the file instead of raising it immediately." He kept looking for another explanation. Kept hoping he was wrong. What happened when he stopped hoping? Marcus's eyes dropped to the table. "I don't know exactly. He never told me. The whole thing said it was safer if I didn't know more than I needed to. But I know he requested a formal meeting with the Inspector General's office 6 weeks before he died. I know that meeting never happened because it got quietly rescheduled twice, and then his training flight went down before the 3rd date ever arrived." The silence that followed lasted long enough that the waitress came by once, refilled coffee neither of them had touched, and left again without a word. "You're telling me," Vivian said, very slowly, very carefully, like each word might detonate if she moved too fast, that my father was killed. Marcus didn't answer right away, which was, in its own way, an answer. Telling you, he finally said, that I've never believed the official report, not for one single day in 7 years. And I'm telling you that this morning, 4 hours after your name went public, somebody with clearance well above mine pulled his sealed file for the first time since it was closed. Vivian sat back against the cracked vinyl booth, feeling something enormous and long-buried shift loose inside her chest. 7 years. 7 years of being told to let it go. 7 years of closed doors and above your clearance, and some things don't stay open twice. 7 years of a grief that never quite finished grieving because some part of her had never believed the story she was handed and had spent every one of those years quietly, secretly, hopelessly waiting for a door to open again. It was opening now. She just didn't know yet how much it was going to cost to walk through it. There's someone you need to talk to, Marcus said, watching her carefully, like he could see the exact moment the decision settled into her. Someone who worked maintenance on your father's squadron. Retired now. Lives about 90 minutes from here. He wouldn't talk to me, said some things are safer coming from family. But I think he'll talk to you. Name, Gus Pruitt. She wrote it down on a napkin with a pen that barely worked, her hand steadier than her heart had any right to be. Gus Pruitt lived in a house at the end of a gravel road that seemed to exist mostly to be forgotten by everyone, except the man who'd chosen it. A single-story ranch with a wraparound porch and a hangar-sized workshop out back that looked, from the outside, more cared for than the house itself. He was 71 years old. Hands like old leather, scarred across the knuckles in a dozen places that told their own quiet history of 31 years spent elbow-deep in aircraft engines. He answered the door before Vivian had even finished knocking, like he'd been watching the road for longer than he wanted to admit. You're Marcia's girl. Not a question. Vivian. I know. He stepped back from the door, wordlessly waving her inside. Saw your face on the news yesterday. Had to sit down for a minute after that. You look just like him. Same eyes. Same way of standing, like you're bracing for something even when nothing's happening yet. The inside of the house was neat, in the particular way of a man who lived alone and had made peace with it a long time ago. A single framed photograph on the mantel caught her eye immediately. 2 men in flight suits, younger, laughing at something outside the frame, one of them unmistakably her father. That was taken the year before he made colonel, Gus said, following her gaze. Best boss I ever had. Best man, too, which isn't always the same thing in this business. Marcus Webb said you might talk to me. Webb's a good man. Careful, though. Careful in a way that kept him alive, probably. Gus gestured toward a worn armchair, lowered himself slowly into the one across from it. I'm 71. Retired. Nobody can touch my pension anymore, and I don't much care what they do to my reputation at this point. So yeah, I'll talk to you. Question is whether you're ready to hear it. I've been ready for 7 years. Gus studied her for a long moment. Something in his weathered face softened, just slightly. Your father, he said, found out that a maintenance contractor called Kestrel Aerospace Solutions had been supplying substandard replacement components to 3 different bases for going on 2 years. Heat exchangers, bleed air valves, parts that looked right on paper, tested right in the initial certification batch, and then started failing at almost triple the expected rate once they hit real rotation in real aircraft. Vivian's pulse had gone very quiet in her ears, the way it always did right before something important. He found 4 incidents, Gus continued. 2 minor. 1 serious enough that a pilot had to eject over open desert and broke both legs on landing. And 1 he paused, and something moved across his face that looked almost like grief, arriving fresh, even after 7 years. And 1 that was your father's own aircraft. Except your father wasn't supposed to be flying that training sortie at all. He'd swapped into it at the last minute because a younger pilot had a family emergency. Nobody outside his squadron knew that until the investigation was already closed. Are you saying it was meant for someone else? I'm saying, Gus said quietly, that your father had, 3 days before that flight, submitted a formal written request for an Inspector General meeting to discuss Kestrel Aerospace Solutions and the officer who'd approved their contract. And I'm saying that request went through exactly one desk before that flight ever happened. Whitcomb's desk. Gus nodded once. Slow. Heavy. I can't prove what happened to that aircraft, he said. I've spent 7 years trying, and every door I've knocked on has closed a little faster than the one before it. But I can tell you this. I personally inspected the wreckage debris that was recovered, and the failed component wasn't listed anywhere in the official incident report. It disappeared from the evidence chain between the crash site and the lab. I know, because I logged it myself the night it came in, and I never saw the paperwork again. Vivian sat very still, feeling something enormous and cold settle into the center of her chest. Not shock, exactly. Something quieter and more devastating than shock. The particular grief of having a suspicion confirmed after years of being told it was only grief talking. Why didn't you ever come forward with this? Gus's jaw tightened. I tried, once, 2 months after the crash. Filed an internal complaint about the missing component. He looked down at his scarred hands. 3 weeks later, I got a call informing me my early retirement package had been approved, effective immediately, with a severance bonus that was, frankly, more generous than 31 years of service typically earns a man. Nobody said the word or else out loud. Nobody had to. The silence in the room stretched long and heavy. I should have kept pushing, Gus said, quieter now. I've thought about that every single day for 7 years. I took the money, and I took the quiet, and I told myself there wasn't anything more a retired mechanic could do against a base commander with 3 stars and a legal team. And I've hated myself for that ever since, especially watching you carry it alone all this time, not knowing any of what I just told you. Vivian felt her throat close around something that wasn't quite words yet. What changed, she finally managed. Why now? Gus met her eyes. And for the first time since she'd walked through his door, something like resolve moved across his weathered face. Because yesterday I watched the news, and I saw Colonel Marsh's daughter land a commercial airliner with 2 unconscious pilots, and a fume event that, according to what little detail leaked out, matched a failure signature I haven't seen since the night your father's aircraft came down. And I thought, his voice caught, just slightly, I thought, if that's not a sign that this thing never actually stayed buried, I don't know what is. Vivian sat in that quiet house for a long time after that, the 2 of them saying nothing, the framed photograph of 2 laughing young pilots watching from the mantel like it had been waiting 7 years for exactly this conversation. Because here was the thing that was settling into her now, slow and cold and absolutely certain. The plane she'd landed. The failure signature that had felt so impossibly, horribly familiar the moment she saw it. It wasn't a coincidence. Kestrel Aerospace Solutions was still operating. Still supplying components. Still, evidently, cutting corners that had once cost her father his life, and had very nearly, 4 days ago, cost 141 strangers theirs as well. And the man who had signed off on that original contract 7 years ago, the man who had, according to Gus Pruitt, made a mechanic's inconvenient career disappear, rather than let the truth surface that man was. As of 18 months ago, according to a database search Vivian ran on her phone right there in Gus's living room, still overseeing procurement approvals for aircraft maintenance contracts. Roland Whitcomb hadn't just gotten away with it once. He'd kept doing it for 7 years. While her father's death sat quietly closed in a file cabinet, and 141 strangers nearly paid the price for a truth nobody had ever been allowed to speak out loud. I need everything you have, she said, and her voice had changed. Gone was the flat, careful register she'd used with investigators and reporters, and everyone else who'd asked her questions in the last 36 hours. This was something else. Something that hadn't surfaced in 7 years. Not fully. Not like this. This was Ghost. The version of her that didn't back down. That didn't wait for permission. That had once flown into airspace. That officially didn't exist and come back with information nobody else could get. Because some things are worth the risk. And this was worth more than any mission she'd ever flown. Gus was already rising from his chair, moving toward the workshop out back with a speed that belied his 71 years. "I've got copies," he said over his shoulder. "Not everything, some of it I destroyed years ago, out of fear, and I've regretted that every day since. But what I kept well hidden. Photographs of the maintenance logs before they were altered, a partial parts inventory, and a recording." Vivian's breath caught. A recording of what? Gus stopped at the workshop door, turned back to look at her, his weathered face carrying the particular weight of a man about to hand over something he'd been protecting and hiding from, in equal measure, for 7 long years. "Of your father," he said quietly, explaining, 3 days before he died, exactly what he'd found and exactly who he intended to report it to. "He gave it to me for safekeeping the night before that flight. Told me if anything ever happened to him, I'd know what to do with it." His voice broke, just slightly on the last words. "I'm sorry it took me 7 years to figure out what that was." The next 4 days moved differently than any 4 days. Vivian could remember in 19 years of a career built on discipline and structure and knowing always exactly what came next. Now nothing came next in any order she could predict. She spent them in Gus Pruitt's workshop, mostly, going through boxes of photographs and photocopied maintenance logs that told a story slowly, painfully, one document at a time. A story about a supplier winning a contract it had no business winning. About failure rates quietly buried in internal memos, instead of reported up the chain the way regulations required. About a paper trail that led again and again back to one signature. She listened to the recording exactly once. Her father's voice, 3 days before he died, steady and certain in the way she remembered him always being steady and certain, laying out in careful, methodical detail exactly what he'd found and exactly what he intended to do about it. "I know this isn't going to be easy, Gus. I know it might cost me my career, maybe more than that if I'm being honest with myself. But I've got a daughter out there flying missions that put her life on the line every single time she goes up. And I am not going to be the man who knew people were dying because of parts that shouldn't have passed inspection and did nothing because it was inconvenient to my career. If something happens to me before I get this to the IG, I need you to make sure it doesn't disappear. I need you to make sure Vivian knows the truth, whatever that truth turns out to be." She had to stop the recording halfway through the second time she tried to listen again. Sat in Gus's workshop with her hands pressed flat against her knees, breathing through something that felt too large for her chest to hold until she could stand again. Because here was her father's voice, 7 years gone, telling her exactly what she'd needed to hear for 7 years and hadn't been able to. That he hadn't died by accident. That he'd died because he'd tried to do the right thing. And that he'd known, even then, 3 days before the flight that killed him, that his daughter deserved to know the truth eventually. That he'd trusted someone to make sure of it, even if it took 7 years longer than either of them would have wanted. On the 4th day, Vivian sat across from Marcus Webb again, this time in Gus's living room, the 3 of them surrounded by boxes of evidence that had waited 7 years for someone brave enough, or stubborn enough, to finally put them together. "We take this to the Inspector General," Vivian said. "Formally, on the record, before Whitcomb finds out we have it." "He already might," Marcus said quietly. "Viv, your name has been all over the news for 4 days. Every officer at that base knows Colonel Marsh's daughter is the pilot who landed that plane. It's not exactly a leap for someone to wonder if you'd start asking questions about your father's case again. Then we move fast." "There's something else," Gus said, and something careful in his voice made both of them turn toward him. "I've been thinking about who else might have known parts of this back then. Who else your father might have trusted, even partially, before it all went quiet." "Who?" Gus hesitated. "Your father had a young lieutenant working logistics under him that year. Sharp kid by all accounts, good instincts, better than her rank suggested. Your father used to say she reminded him of you actually, back when you were coming up." Vivian felt something tighten in her stomach. "Name, Ellie Sawyer. Still active duty, far as I know. Made captain a couple years back." Marcus was already shaking his head slowly. If she knew anything back then, she's kept it buried a long time. Careers don't survive getting too close to Kestrel Aerospace and living to tell about it. You've both just demonstrated that. Maybe, Vivian said. Or maybe she's been waiting 7 years for someone brave enough to finally ask her the right question. She thought, not for the first time in the last 4 days, about her father's voice on that recording. Steady, certain. Willing to risk everything because some things matter more than career, more than safety, more than the comfortable silence everyone around him had chosen instead. She understood that choice now in a way she hadn't 7 years ago, because she was about to make the exact same one. Captain Ellie Sawyer agreed to meet Vivian at a coffee shop 3 towns over from the base, at an hour early enough that the only other customers were construction workers grabbing breakfast before a shift. She arrived in civilian clothes, sunglasses on, despite the overcast sky, and sat down across from Vivian with the particular tension of someone who'd spent a long time hoping this conversation would never actually happen. "I know why you're here," she said, before Vivian had even finished sitting down. "And I need you to understand something before we go any further. I have a family. I have a career I've spent 12 years building. I can't." Her voice caught, and she pressed her lips together for a moment, before continuing. "I can't be the person who blows this up. I'm sorry. I know that's not what you want to hear. I'm not asking you to blow anything up," Vivian said carefully. "I'm asking what you know." Ellie was quiet for a long moment, turning a coffee cup slowly between her hands, not unlike the way Marcus had turned his 4 nights ago. "Your father was the best commanding officer I ever served under," she finally said. "He saw something in me nobody else bothered to look for. Pushed me to apply for assignments I didn't think I was ready for. I owe a huge part of my career to him, and I've spent 7 years feeling sick about the fact that I never said any of that out loud when it might have mattered. What do you know about Kestrel Aerospace Solutions?" Ellie's eyes flicked up, sharp and sudden. "How do you—" "I know enough," Vivian said quietly. "I need to know what you saw." Ellie was silent for a long time. Long enough that Vivian thought she might simply get up and leave, the way careful people do when a conversation gets too close to a line they've drawn for their own survival. Instead, she leaned forward, voice dropping to barely above a whisper. 6 weeks before your father died, I processed a procurement file that had already been flagged twice by 2 separate junior officers for irregular bidding practices. I was young. I didn't fully understand what I was looking at. But I remember your father coming into the logistics office late one night, going through that file himself. And I remember the look on his face when he found something in the appendix that made him go very quiet. What was in the appendix? A secondary vendor relationship, buried 3 layers deep in subcontractor disclosures. Kestrel Aerospace Solutions was, at the time, partially owned by a holding company that also happened to have a business relationship with a private consulting firm. Ellie's voice dropped even lower. Consulting firm that, according to public disclosure filings, had paid a substantial advisory fee to a retired general the year before that general returned to active service in an oversight capacity. Vivian felt the floor of the coffee shop tilt slightly beneath her. Whitcomb. Ellie didn't say the name out loud. She didn't have to. The look on her face was answer enough. I flagged it to your father, she said. That same night. And 3 days later, her voice cracked, and this time she didn't try to hide it. 3 days later, he was dead, and the file I'd flagged had already been reclassified above my clearance level, and everyone above me made it very clear, without ever quite saying it directly, that continuing to ask questions about it would be a career-ending decision. I was 26 years old. I had 6 years left on my commitment, and a mortgage I couldn't afford to lose an income against. So I stopped asking. I understand, Vivian said, and meant it, in a way she hadn't quite expected to, because there was no anger in her, sitting across from this young woman who had made a choice 7 years ago, that Vivian herself had made, in her own way, every single time she'd let someone tell her to let it go. I have copies, Ellie said quietly, of that appendix. I kept them, even though I knew I shouldn't have. I told myself it was just in case. I never really believed I'd need them. She reached into her bag, hands trembling slightly, and slid a small flash drive across the table. If I give you this, she said, I need you to understand what it could cost me, what it could cost my family. Vivian closed her hand around the drive, felt the weight of it, small and cold and enormous all at once. I understand, she said, and I promise you, Ellie, whatever happens next, I will do everything in my power to make sure you're protected. But I can't promise you it'll be easy. I can only promise you it's the right thing. Ellie's eyes were wet behind her sunglasses. Your father used to say something similar, she said softly, about doing the right thing even when it costs you. I used to think it was just something officers said in briefings to sound noble. She shook her head slowly. I don't think that anymore. That evening, back in Gus Pruitt's workshop, the three of them sat around a laptop, watching the contents of Ellie Sawyer's flash drive load onto the screen in silence. It was worse than any of them had expected. Not just a contract irregularity, a pattern years deep, meticulously hidden behind layers of shell companies and consulting fees and advisory relationships that all, eventually, traced back to the same small circle of names. Whitcomb's name appeared 4 times, each instance buried under enough bureaucratic language that no casual reader would ever connect the dots. But Vivian wasn't a casual reader. Neither, it turned out, was Gus, whose 31 years of maintenance experience let him translate half the technical jargon the other two couldn't pass on their own. This isn't just about your father anymore, Marcus said quietly, around midnight, staring at a spreadsheet that documented 17 separate incidents across 4 different bases over 6 years, incidents that ranged from minor to, in 2 cases, fatal. This is a pattern that's killed people, Viv, multiple times, and every single time it's been buried. Then we make sure it can't be buried again. They worked through the night, compiling everything into a formal complaint: Gus's photographs, Ellie's appendix, the recording of her father's voice, Vivian's own recollection of the failure signature she'd witnessed 31,000 feet above Nebraska 4 days earlier. By the time dawn broke over the gravel road outside Gus's house, they had something that felt, for the first time in 7 years, like enough. We take it to the Inspector General's office directly, Vivian said, watching the sky lighten through Gus's kitchen window. In person. All of us together, so no single one of us can be quietly discredited or reassigned before it's on the record. When? Marcus asked. Today. It was, in hindsight, the mistake that nearly cost them everything. Because somewhere between Gus Pruitt's gravel road and the federal building, 3 hours away where the Inspector General's regional office kept its doors, someone had already learned exactly where they were headed. Vivian would spend a long time afterward trying to understand how, trying to trace the leak backward through every phone call, every conversation, every moment over those 4 days where someone might have overheard something they shouldn't have. It came down, in the end, to a single conversation she hadn't been part of. 2 nights earlier, Havoc Major Derek Boone, the pilot who'd escorted her plane in, the man whose voice over a broken radio relay had helped guide her home safely, had called an old friend in base logistics, off the record, just to ask, out of pure curiosity and pilot's instinct, whether anyone had heard anything about why Colonel Marsh's daughter, was suddenly spending so much time off base with a retired mechanic and a records clerk. He hadn't meant anything by it. He genuinely hadn't. It was the kind of idle question pilots asked each other constantly, the professional grapevine that ran underneath every base in the country. He had no way of knowing that the friend he'd asked reported. Eventually, 3 layers up a chain that ended, quietly and without anyone quite realizing the significance of what they were passing along, on the desk of a man who had spent 7 years making sure nothing about Colonel Thomas Marsh's death ever surfaced again. Roland Whitcomb. They were 40 minutes from the federal building, driving in Marcus's car along a 2-lane highway that cut through empty farmland on either side, when Vivian's phone rang with a number she didn't recognize. She almost didn't answer it. Something made her. "This is Marsh." Silence on the other end, long enough that she almost hung up. Then a voice she recognized instantly, even though she hadn't heard it in 8 months. Even though the last time she'd heard it, it had been offering warm, generous congratulations on her retirement. Lieutenant Colonel Marsh, Roland Whitcomb's voice, smooth and measured as ever, carrying not one hint of the 7 years of buried violence sitting beneath it. I understand you've been quite busy since your remarkable landing. I wonder if we might have a conversation. Before you do anything you can't take back. Vivian felt every muscle in her body go very still. General, I know what you think you have, Whitcomb said, and his voice had dropped, just slightly, into something colder and more careful than his opening pleasantries. I want you to consider, very carefully, what happens to everyone involved once this becomes public. Not just me, Colonel. Everyone. Your mechanic friend, who took a very generous severance package that could look, under the wrong scrutiny, like something else entirely. Your young captain, whose career I would hate to see derailed over a misunderstanding. And you, Vivian, a decorated officer whose reputation, right now, is untouchable, a national hero. That reputation is worth protecting. For everyone's sake. Is that a threat? It's a kindness, Whitcomb said softly. One I'm offering exactly once. The line went dead. Vivian sat frozen in the passenger seat, staring at her phone, feeling something cold and absolute settle into her chest. What did he say? Marcus asked, glancing over, already reading something in her face that told him it was bad before she said a word. He knows where we're headed, Vivian said quietly, which means he knows everything. Which means her phone buzzed again. A text this time, from Gus, who'd taken a separate car with the physical evidence, the photographs and logs too sensitive to risk in a single vehicle. 3 words that made her blood run cold. Being followed. Hurry. Go, Vivian said to Marcus, already twisting around to look at the empty highway behind them. Now we need to get to Gus before. She didn't finish the sentence, because in the rear-view mirror, still distant but closing fast, a dark sedan had just pulled out from a side road behind them, and something about the way it moved, steady, deliberate, matching their speed exactly, instead of passing, told Vivian everything she needed to know. 7 years of silence. 7 years of closed doors and above your clearance and let it go. It was about to catch up with all of them, right here, on an empty 2-lane highway 40 minutes from the one place that might finally make it stop for good. And for the first time since she'd walked into that cockpit 5 days ago, hands steady, mind narrowed down to nothing but the next 3 seconds. And the 3 seconds after that, for the first time, Vivian Marsh didn't know if she was going to make it to the runway in time. This is a work of fiction. Fort Callahan, Ridgeview, Kestrel Aerospace Solutions, and every officer, agency, and organization named here exist only within this story. The sedan closed the distance in under a minute, which should have been impossible, which was impossible on a public highway in broad daylight. Except impossible had stopped meaning much of anything to Vivian Marsh, somewhere around the 3rd time in 1 week that her life had turned into something out of a report nobody would believe. Marcus, her voice flat, controlled, the voice she used to give when a wingman needed information, not comfort. 90 seconds, maybe less, I see it. Don't speed up yet. Let them think we haven't noticed. Because that's the first rule you learn flying contested airspace. You don't show your hand until you have to. You watch, you wait. You let the threat commit to something before you commit to anything back. Except this wasn't a cockpit. This was a 2-lane county highway with cornfields on either side and nowhere to go if things went the way her stomach was already telling her they might. Her phone buzzed again. Gus, they're boxing me in 2 vehicles. I'm turning off at the Miller Road exit. Vivian's hands went cold around the phone. Change of plan, she said. Gus needs us now. Marcus didn't argue, didn't ask a single unnecessary question. Just took the next exit hard enough that the tires complained, and Vivian braced one hand against the door and thought, absurdly, of every single time in 19 years she'd trusted a pilot beside her with exactly this kind of split-second decision and never once been let down. They found Gus's truck 4 minutes later, pulled off onto the gravel shoulder of Miller Road, hazards blinking, hood up like he'd staged a breakdown on purpose. Because he had. Genius, Vivian breathed, already out of the car before it had fully stopped. Gus was crouched by the front tire, not actually doing anything to it, watching the road behind him with the sharp, still focus of a man who had spent 31 years learning to read machines and, apparently, had learned to read danger just as well. They peeled off, he said, not looking up. Once I pulled over here in plain sight of that gas station. Guess they didn't want witnesses. Are you hurt? Just old. He straightened slowly, one hand pressed to his lower back. Box in the truck bed's untouched. Photographs, logs, everything. I loaded the flash drive copy into 3 separate places before we left the house this morning. Man doesn't survive 31 years around aircraft without learning redundancy matters. Vivian felt something loosen in her chest, just slightly, just enough to breathe, until her phone rang again. Unknown number. Same area code as the last call. She almost didn't answer. Marcus caught her eye. Small nod. Answer it. This is Marsh. Whitcomb's voice again. Except something in it had changed since the last call. The smoothness was thinner now, stretched over something underneath that sounded, but the first time, almost like fear. You're making a very serious mistake, Colonel. Funny. I was about to say the same thing to you. A pause, long enough that she could hear, faintly, something in the background, a door closing. Footsteps, the particular acoustics of an office with too much glass and not enough soul. Your father, Whitcomb said, made the exact same mistake 7 years ago. Refused to understand that some things are bigger than one man's conscience. I would hate to see history repeat itself with his daughter. Something inside Vivian went very cold and very still. Is that a threat, General? It's a fact, he said. Facts don't care whether you like them. The line went dead. Vivian stood on the gravel shoulder of a rural highway, phone still pressed to her ear, staring at nothing, feeling 7 years of grief and rage and unanswered questions collapse into a single, absolute certainty. He had just, without quite meaning to, confirmed everything. He as good as admitted it, she said, turning to Marcus and Gus, on a recorded line. He just told me my father's death wasn't an accident. Did you record that call? Marcus asked. No. Her jaw tightened. But he doesn't know that. Gus was already climbing back into his truck. Then we need to move faster than he expects. Because a scared man with 3 stars and something to lose is a lot more dangerous than a confident one. They reached the federal building at 11:30. All 3 vehicles parked in the same visitor lot. The 3 of them walking in together or through glass doors that felt, after everything, almost anticlimactic in their ordinariness. Except ordinary didn't last. Because waiting in the lobby, arms crossed, expression unreadable, stood a face Vivian hadn't expected and, for one disorienting half-second, didn't know how to read. Havoc. Major Derek Boone in uniform. Alone you, Vivian said, and something in her voice carried more warning than she meant it to. I know how this looks, he said quickly, both hands rising slightly, a gesture of surrender before she'd even accused him of anything. I need 5 minutes, please. You told someone where we were going. His face went pale, genuinely pale, in a way that told her, even through the anger still burning low in her chest, that whatever had happened, it hadn't been intentional. I made 1 phone call, he said, 2 nights ago, to a friend in logistics. I asked if anyone knew why you were spending time with a retired mechanic and a records clerk. That's it. That's all I said. I swear to you, Vivian, I had no idea it would go anywhere. His voice cracked slightly. I was just trying to understand what was happening to the woman who saved 141 lives on my watch. That's all it was. Vivian studied his face for a long moment, searching for a lie and not finding one. That call reached Whitcomb, she said. Somehow, through however many layers I know. His jaw tightened. I found out an hour ago. Someone in logistics mentioned, offhand, that General Whitcomb's office had called asking pointed questions about your movements. I put it together fast, and I have never in my career felt sicker about anything I've done. So, what are you doing here? Fixing it, he said simply. However I can. He reached into his jacket, pulled out a small recorder, the kind used for official statements, and set it on the lobby's low table between them. I called that friend back an hour ago, he said. told him I needed everything he remembered about who he passed my question to, and why. He didn't want to talk at first. Then I reminded him 141 people are alive right now because of the woman he helped put in danger, and he changed his mind fast. He pressed play. A voice, nervous, young, clearly uncomfortable, laid out, haltingly, exactly how a casual question from Major Boone had traveled up through 3 separate conversations before landing, within 6 hours, on the desk of General Whitcomb's aide. It wasn't proof of Whitcomb's crimes, but it was proof of something almost as valuable. Proof that he'd moved the instant he heard Vivian's name connected to questions about the past. Proof of consciousness of guilt, the exact phrase Denise Okonkwo used 20 minutes later, when Vivian, Marcus, Gus, and Havoc sat across from her in a conference room that suddenly felt very small for the size of what they were about to lay on the table. Okonkwo listened for 3 hours without interrupting more than a handful of times. She examined Gus's photographs one by one, laying them out across the table like pieces of a puzzle, finally being assembled after 7 years, scattered in different drawers. She listened to the recording of Thomas Marsh's voice twice, her face carefully neutral both times, though Vivian noticed her hands had gone very still during the second listen. She reviewed Ellie Sawyer's flash drive with a technician summoned specifically for that purpose, watching the pattern of shell companies and consulting fees unfold across a screen with the particular grim satisfaction of an investigator finding finally a shape she'd suspected existed for a long time but had never been able to prove. And she listened, last of all, to Havoc's recording of the logistics chain that had carried Vivian's movements straight to Whitcomb's office within hours. When it was finally over, Okonkwo sat back, removed her reading glasses, rubbed the bridge of her nose in a gesture that suggested exhaustion far beyond one long afternoon. "I need to tell you something," she said quietly, "that I probably shouldn't tell you yet, but given everything you've just handed me, I think you've earned it." Vivian's whole body went still. "There have been whispers," Okonkwo said, "about Kestrel Aerospace Solutions for almost 2 years. Anonymous tips. None of them ever came with anything solid enough to justify a full investigation, because every time we got close, the trail went cold in ways that felt engineered rather than coincidental." She gestured at the table full of evidence between them. "This is the first time anyone has handed me something solid enough to actually move." "What happens now?" Marcus asked. "Now I take this to my director. Today, and within 72 hours, assuming the evidence holds up under initial review, which," she glanced again at the photographs, at the recording device, still sitting on the table, "I have very little doubt it will. General Whitcomb will be placed on administrative leave pending a formal inquiry." 72 hours, Vivian repeated, something cold moving through her chest. "That's a long time for a man who already knows we're here." Okonkwo met her eyes. "I understand your concern. I'll request expedited protective measures for everyone in this room. But I won't lie to you, Colonel Marsh. A man like Whitcomb doesn't build a career on this kind of concealment without also building contingencies for the day it finally comes apart." She was right to warn them, because 2 nights later, at 11:47 p.m., Gus Pruitt's workshop caught fire. Vivian got the call from Marcus at 12:03 a.m. His voice tightened fast, in a way she'd never heard from him before, not even 5 days ago in that diner off Route 9. "Gus is okay," he said, before she could even ask, before the fear climbing her throat had fully formed into words. "He's okay, Viv." He got out, but the workshop a pause, heavy with something that sounded almost like grief. "The workshop's gone. Everything in it. Fire investigators are already saying it doesn't look accidental." Vivian was in her car within 4 minutes, driving through the dark toward Gus's gravel road with her hand steady on the wheel and something entirely different roaring underneath her ribs. She found Gus sitting on the tailgate of his truck, wrapped in a blanket some neighbor had draped over his shoulders, watching what remained of 31 years of careful work collapse into embers and smoke under the floodlights of 2 fire trucks. "I'm sorry," she said, sitting down beside him, not quite sure what else there was to say to a man who'd just lost, in one violent hour, both his life's work and the physical evidence he'd spent 7 years protecting. Don't be. His voice was rough, steady though, in a way that surprised her. I told you. Redundancy. 3 copies of everything, remember? This, he gestured at the smoldering wreckage. This was never going to be the only place it lived. They don't know that. No, Gus agreed, and something almost like satisfaction moved across his weathered face despite everything. No, they don't, which means somewhere tonight, a very frightened man is congratulating himself for solving a problem he hasn't actually solved at all. The fire, it turned out, was the mistake that finally broke the case wide open. Because arson investigators, called in immediately given the ongoing federal inquiry already underway, found accelerant traces and a partial tire impression in the mud near the workshop's side entrance. A tire impression that, when cross-referenced against vehicle registrations connected to General Whitcomb's known associates, matched a sedan registered to a private security consultant who had, according to public records Ellie Sawyer had already flagged 3 days earlier, received payments from the same holding company connected to Kestrel Aerospace Solutions. The circle finally closed all the way around. Denise Okonkwo called Vivian at 7 the next morning, her voice carrying an urgency that hadn't been there 3 days earlier. We're moving today, she said. Not 72 hours, today. The arson attempt changes everything we now have evidence of: witness, intimidation, and destruction of evidence in an active federal inquiry, which gives us grounds to act immediately instead of waiting on the standard review timeline. What do you need from me? I need you at the base by 9. All of you. Because we're not just placing General Whitcomb on leave anymore, Colonel Marsh. A pause, and something in Okonkwo's voice carried, for the first time, an edge of something that sounded almost like satisfaction of her own. We're arresting him. The scene that unfolded at Fort Callahan that morning would end up, months later, in a training case study taught at 3 different service academies as an example of how institutional corruption gets uncovered when enough brave people refuse to stay quiet. In the moment, it looked considerably less tidy than any case study would suggest. Vivian arrived at the base just before 9, walking into a hallway outside the base commander's office that had gone unnaturally, tensely quiet, the particular silence of a building that already knows something enormous is about to happen and hasn't yet been told the details. Marcus was already there. Gus, insisting despite Vivian's protests that he wasn't missing this for anything. Havoc, in uniform, standing slightly apart with the careful posture of a man still working through his own guilt over the last week, and arriving 5 minutes later, breathless and pale, Ellie Sawyer, who'd taken emergency leave the moment Okonkwo's office called her that morning. They stood together in that hallway, an unlikely coalition assembled from 7 years of buried grief and 4 days of impossible courage, and waited. At 9:14 a.m., 2 federal agents and a base security detail walked into General Roland Whitcomb's office. At 9:19, they walked back out. Whitcomb between them, hands cuffed in front of him, face a mask of controlled fury that cracked just once when his eyes found Vivian standing in the hallway. You have no idea what you've done, he said, low and cold, as they walked him past. No idea how much bigger this is than you understand. Vivian met his eyes. Didn't flinch. Didn't look away. I know exactly what I've done, she said, her voice carrying the particular calm certainty that had once helped her land a wounded airliner with 141 lives depending on her steady hands. I finished what my father started. 7 years late, but finished. Whitcomb's jaw tightened. He said nothing else. Let the agents lead him away down a hallway lined officers who had until this morning saluted him without question for the better part of a decade. The formal inquiry, when it concluded 4 months later, would document a pattern of corruption spanning nearly 9 years, falsified safety certifications, buried incident reports, a network of shell companies designed to obscure a base commander's financial relationship with a supplier whose substandard components had, by the final count, contributed to 11 separate incidents across 4 bases. 2 of those incidents had been fatal. One of them had been Colonel Thomas Marsh. The federal case against Roland Whitcomb would take the better part of a year to fully resolve. Vivian testified twice, once before the Inspector General's formal board, once, months later, in a courtroom that felt both enormous and strangely small, packed with reporters and former colleagues, and, in the back row, quiet and unassuming in civilian clothes, Gus Pruitt, Marcus Webb, and Ellie Sawyer, all three of them there for every single day of testimony, despite none of them being legally required to attend. Havoc came too, every day, sat beside them without a word, his own quiet penance for a phone call he still hadn't fully forgiven himself for making. The verdict, when it finally came, used language that felt, in its careful legal precision, almost too small for what it actually meant. Guilty, on all counts. Vivian sat in the courtroom gallery when the judge read it, her hand wrapped tightly around Renee's, who had flown in for the final week of proceedings and refused to leave her sister's side for a single hour of it. She didn't cry. She'd told herself, all those months ago on that first flight to Chicago, that she hadn't cried in 4 years. That habit, it turned out, held even now, even here, even with 7 years of grief finally, formally, legally acknowledged by a system that had spent 7 years denying it existed at all. But something else happened instead. Something that felt, in its own way, even larger than tears. She breathed, fully, for what felt like the first time in 7 years. Because the weight she'd carried since that folded flag was placed in her hands, at 23 years old, the weight of a truth she'd always known and could never prove, of a grief that never finished grieving, because some part of her refused to accept the official story. That weight finally, set itself down, not gone. Grief like that never fully leaves, but different now, lighter, carried at last alongside truth instead of against the crushing absence of it. 3 weeks after the verdict, Vivian drove out to the National Cemetery, where her father had been laid to rest 7 years earlier, in a section reserved for officers whose service had earned them a place among rows of identical white stones stretching toward a horizon that never seemed to end. She hadn't visited in over a year, hadn't been able to, if she was honest with herself, hadn't been able to stand at that grave and accept the word closed that had sat, for 7 years, like a stone in her own chest. She could stand there now. She knelt in the grass beside the stone that read Cole Thomas J. Marsh, ran her fingers over letters she'd traced 100 times before, and, finally, for the first time in 7 years, said the words out loud that she'd been carrying silently since the day a man in dress uniform sat down in her living room to deliver news that had reshaped the rest of her life. "I found it, Dad." Her voice steady, certain, the voice of a woman who had spent 19 years learning that some things are worth risking everything for. Everything you were trying to tell them. I found it and I finished it, and he's not going to hurt anyone else ever again. The wind moved through the rows of white stones, quiet and patient, the way it always does in places built to hold grief that has nowhere else to go. "I'm sorry it took me so long," she said softly. "I'm sorry I let them tell me to let it go. I should have trusted what I already knew." She sat there a long while, the sun climbing slowly overhead, until the ache in her knees reminded her that some things, even grief, eventually have to make room for the rest of a life still waiting to be lived. When she finally rose, brushing grass from her knees, she felt something settle into place that had been missing for 7 years. Not closure exactly. Closure was too tidy a word for something this complicated, this hard-won. Peace maybe. The particular, quiet peace that comes only after truth, however delayed, however costly, finally gets to stand in the light where it belongs. The media attention, in the weeks following the verdict, reached a pitch Vivian had never quite anticipated and never quite wanted. Every major network wanted an interview. A morning show offered her a sum of money that made her blink twice when she heard the number. A publisher reached out about a book deal, her story, told in her own words, ghostwritten if she preferred, structured however she wanted, with an advance large enough to change her life financially in ways 19 years of military service never had. She turned down every single one. Gave one brief statement to a local reporter. The same week the verdict came down flat factual, no more emotional than a flight debrief, because that was the only language she still fully trusted when it came to things this large. My father tried to do the right thing, she said, standing on courthouse steps with Renee beside her and a dozen microphones angled toward her face. It cost him his life. It's taken 7 years, but the truth finally caught up to the people responsible. That's all I have to say. Then she stopped talking. To everyone. For good. She turned down the congressional recognition ceremony that followed 3 months later, sending a brief, polite letter explaining that she appreciated the honor but preferred, respectfully, not to attend. She turned down the airline's offer of a lifetime of first-class travel, the speaking engagements, the countless invitations to tell her story to rooms full of strangers who wanted, more than anything, to hear about the miracle landing and the corruption scandal wrapped into one tidy, triumphant narrative. Because the truth she'd learned over the last several months was rarely tidy. It was hard-won and expensive, and had cost people things that no amount of recognition could ever fully repay. Gus Pruitt had lost 31 years of collected work in a fire set specifically to silence him. Ellie Sawyer had risked a career she'd spent 12 years building. Marcus Webb had carried a secret alone for 7 years that had clearly worn something down in him that might never fully repair. And her father had lost everything 7 years too early for the simple, devastating crime of refusing to look away from something wrong. No ceremony could fix any of that. What she wanted instead, in the quiet months that followed, was something smaller, something that felt to her more honest. She got a small apartment near Renee's house in Chicago, close enough to walk to her sister's for dinner most Sundays, close enough that her niece and nephew had started treating her less like a distant relative and more like a permanent fixture in their lives, which suited her more than she ever would have admitted a year earlier. She started teaching, almost by accident, when a friend from her old squadron asked if she'd consider guest lecturing a single evening class on aviation safety at the local community college. She said yes, mostly to be polite, found, to her genuine surprise, that she didn't hate it the way she'd expected to. The students were mostly older adults, career changers, retirees looking for something to fill their days, a handful of younger students genuinely interested in aviation as a field. None of them, at first, connected the quiet, precise woman teaching their Tuesday night class to the name that had dominated headlines the previous spring. Until one evening, near the end of the semester, a student raised her hand during a discussion about safety protocols and asked, carefully, almost apologetically, whether Vivian had ever encountered a real emergency situation in her own flying career. Vivian was quiet for a long moment. The classroom waited, unusually still, sensing without quite knowing why that this question landed differently than the dozen questions before it. Yes, she finally said once. She told them, briefly, factually, the version she'd give anyone who asked directly, stripped of drama, stripped of the parts that still, months later, sometimes visited her at 3 a.m. and required more effort to set back down than she let anyone see. When she finished, the classroom was silent for a moment, before a different student, older, quieter, someone who'd sat in the back row all semester, without saying much of anything, spoke up. What happened to the people responsible for the parts that failed? I remember that story. Vivian looked at her for a long moment. They were held accountable, she said simply. It took longer than it should have. It cost more than it should have. But eventually, yes, they were. The student nodded slowly, seeming to understand there was a great deal more beneath that simple answer than Vivian was willing to share in a classroom on a Tuesday night. She didn't push further. Nobody did. That was, Vivian had come to understand, exactly the kind of recognition she could live with. Quiet, honest, offered only when someone genuinely wanted to know, never performed for an audience that wanted spectacle instead of truth. One evening in late autumn, nearly a year after the flight that changed everything, Vivian sat on the small balcony of her Chicago apartment, watching the last of the daylight fade over a skyline that had, slowly, over the past months, started to feel less like a temporary landing place and more like something close to home. Her phone buzzed. A text from Gus, who had, in the months since the fire, begun the slow, careful process of rebuilding his workshop. Funded partly by a settlement, the federal case had eventually secured for damages tied directly to the arson attempt. New roofs up. Come see it sometime. Bring your sister. I make a decent pot of coffee for a man who almost lost everything twice in his life. She smiled, typed back a promise to visit soon, and meant it. Another text arrived minutes later. Ellie Sawyer, who had, against every fear she'd carried into that coffee shop conversation, not only kept her career, but been quietly recommended for a promotion by an interim base command eager to distance itself, as visibly as possible, from the corruption of the previous administration. Thinking of your dad today. Wanted you to know that. Vivian held the phone for a long moment, watching the sky finish its slow fade into evening, feeling something settle in her chest that had taken the better part of a year, and 7 years before that, to finally, fully arrive. Her father's death would never stop being a loss. Some griefs don't resolve so much as they change shape, becoming something a person learns to carry differently rather than something they ever fully set down. But the not knowing, the 7 years of closed-off doors above your clearance, some things don't stay open twice. That particular weight was gone now, replaced by something harder than one and in its own way, more valuable. The truth, finally standing where it belonged, in the light, where her father had always believed it deserved to be, even when believing it cost him everything. She thought sometimes about the moment on that airplane, 31,000 feet above a Nebraska sky the color of an old bruise, when she'd first felt that faint, wrong asymmetry in the engine's tone and known, with a certainty her conscious mind hadn't yet caught up to, that something was deeply wrong. She understood now what that moment had actually been. Not just an emergency, not just a test of 19 years of training finally called upon in the sky. It had been her father, in a strange, impossible way, finally reaching her after 7 years of silence, handing her, without either of them ever choosing it, the exact thread she needed to finally pull the whole truth into the light. She didn't believe in signs, not really. 19 years of flying had taught her to trust instruments and training over anything that felt too convenient to be real. But some nights, sitting on that small balcony with the Chicago skyline glowing gold and silver against the darkening sky, she allowed herself, just for a moment, to believe that maybe, somehow, her father had known exactly what he was doing when he chose, all those years ago, to trust his daughter with the truth eventually, however long it took to arrive. Ghost, her old squadron commander, used to say, "You never know she's in the fight until the fight's already over." She thought her father would have liked that description in the end. Not because she'd fought invisibly, the way she once had in skies that officially didn't exist, but because, this time, when the fight mattered most, she hadn't stayed hidden at all. She'd stood in the light, said the truth out loud, and made absolutely certain that everyone, finally, after 7 long years, heard it. This is a work of fiction. Every name, base, and organization in this story is invented. 2 years is a long time to carry a name that isn't fully your own anymore. Second Lieutenant Casey Doran had heard the story before she ever set foot on a flight line. Heard it the way most young pilots did secondhand, embellished, passed between bunks and briefing rooms like something half myth, half warning. A woman who landed an airliner with no training on the aircraft. A general who fell from 3 stars to a federal prison sentence. A call sign that made veteran fighter pilots go quiet on an open channel. Ghost. Casey was 24 years old, 6 months out of flight school, and she did not, if she was honest with herself, entirely believe half of what she'd heard. Until the day Lieutenant Colonel Vivian Marsh walked into her squadron's safety briefing room as a guest instructor, and the entire room pilots twice Casey's experience. Men and women who had flown actual combat sorties went still in a way Casey had never witnessed before. Not fear. Something else. Something that looked, from where Casey sat in the back row, almost like reverence held very carefully in check. Most of you have heard some version of my story, Vivian said, setting a folder down on the podium without opening it. I'd like to tell you the real one. Not because the story matters, because the lesson underneath it does. She talked for 40 minutes. No slides, no notes. Just a voice, steady and unhurried, walking them through a morning 7 years distant now, and a decision that had taken 4 seconds to make and a lifetime to fully understand. Casey found herself leaning forward without meaning to, the way you lean toward a fire in a cold room. What struck her most wasn't the landing, wasn't the F-22 escort, or the broken radios, or the transponder squawking into empty sky. It was the moment near the end of Vivian's talk, when her voice dropped just slightly, and she looked out at the room of young pilots as she eyed of young pilots like she was seeing something in each of their faces that they couldn't yet see in themselves. Every one of you is going to have a moment, Vivian said, somewhere in your career, where the training says one thing and the fear says another. I need you to trust the training. Not because fear is wrong. Fear keeps you alive most days. But in that one moment, when it matters most, trust what your hands already know how to do. After the briefing ended, most of the room filed out slowly, murmuring among themselves, a few pilots working up the nerve to approach and shake Vivian's hand. Casey held back, waited until the room had nearly cleared. Ma'am. Her voice came out smaller than she wanted it to. Can I ask you something? Vivian looked from the folder she'd been packing away, studied Casey for a moment with an expression that felt, somehow, like it was measuring something deeper than the question that hadn't even been asked yet. You can ask. How did you know, Casey said, that you could do it, fly a plane you'd never trained on? In that moment, how did you know you weren't going to freeze? Something shifted, very slightly in Vivian's expression. Not quite a smile. Something older and more careful than that. I didn't know, she said. That's the part nobody wants to hear. I didn't know I could do it. I just knew that 141 people were going to die if I didn't try. Casey stood there, absorbing that, feeling something in her chest that she didn't yet have words for. The knowing, Vivian continued, comes after, sometimes years after. You do the thing first, because it has to be done, and you spend the rest of your life understanding why you were able to. She reached into her bag, pulled out a small card worn at the edges, clearly carried for a long time. My father gave me something like this once, she said, handing it to Casey. Not the actual card, the idea of it. He told me that courage isn't a feeling you wait to arrive before you act. It's a decision you make before you feel ready, and the feeling catches up eventually, usually after the hard part's already over. Casey looked down at the card. A simple printed quote, the kind you might find in a gift shop, except something about the worn edges made it feel like it carried more weight than its simple words suggested. Do the right thing, even when it costs you. Especially when it costs you. Keep it, Vivian said. I've got the original memorized by now. Hasn't done me much good keeping the physical copy in a drawer. Casey held the card carefully, like something that might break if she gripped it wrong. Thank you, she said, for all of it. The story. This. I don't think I would have understood before today what any of it actually meant. Vivian's expression softened, just slightly, into something that looked almost like recognition of herself, years younger, standing somewhere similar. You will, she said. One day. Probably not the way you expect. She turned to leave, then paused at the door, looking back at Casey with something that felt, for just a moment, less like an instructor addressing a student and more like one pilot recognizing another across a gap of years and experience that suddenly didn't feel quite as wide as it had that morning. What's your call sign? Vivian asked. Casey flushed slightly. Don't have one yet, ma'am. Still too new. You will, Vivian said again, and this time there was something almost like a smile in it. Make sure it's one you're proud to carry. Some names follow you a lot longer than you expect them to. 3 months later, Casey Doran flew her first solo intercept mission, a routine training exercise gone briefly, unexpectedly wrong, when a mechanical fault forced an emergency landing procedure she'd only ever practiced in simulators, she thought, in the 4 seconds it took to make the decision that saved her aircraft. Of a small worn card in her flight bag, and a woman who had once told her that the knowing comes after. She was right, it did. Gus Pruitt's workshop, rebuilt now with a roof that no longer leaked and walls that smelled faintly of fresh lumber instead of 31 years of accumulated history, had become, over the 2 years since the fire, something of an unofficial gathering place. Not planned, not organized by anyone in particular. It had simply happened, the way these things sometimes do. Marcus Webb, stopping by on his way through the state for a conference, staying longer than he meant to over coffee and old stories. Ellie Sawyer, now a major, bringing her 2 young children out on weekends to watch Gus tinker with an old engine he kept around purely for the satisfaction of it, no longer needing the income his skilled hands could still easily earn. Havoc came most often. Something about the quiet of that workshop, the smell of oil and sawdust, seemed to settle something in him that 2 years hadn't quite managed to settle on its own. He'd never fully forgiven himself for that phone call, the one that had nearly gotten 3 people killed. Vivian had told him, more than once, that forgiveness wasn't hers to withhold when he'd never actually needed it in the first place. He kept coming anyway, kept needing to hear it. On a warm Saturday in early June, nearly 2 years to the day since Flight 619 had made its emergency landing, the workshop filled with more people than it had seen at once since the rebuild. Vivian and Renee, Gus and his newly adopted habit of hosting anyone who wandered by, Marcus down for the weekend, Ellie with her kids chasing each other around the yard, Havoc and Ice, who had, in the 2 years since, gotten married in a small ceremony none of them had expected, but all of them had been overjoyed to attend. Gus stood at the head of a long table set up in the yard, coffee in hand, looking out at the small, unlikely family that had assembled itself out of the wreckage of 7 years of buried grief. Your father, he said, looking at Vivian across the table, would have loved this. All of you. Sitting here because of something he started and something you finished. Vivian felt her throat tighten, the way it still sometimes did, 2 years later, when someone mentioned her father in a context that felt less like grief and more like gratitude. He would have liked the coffee less, she said, and the table laughed. The particular warm laughter of people who had been through something together and come out the other side still standing, still choosing each other. Later that evening, as the sun began its slow descent, and the kids finally wore themselves into quiet exhaustion on a blanket near the workshop door, Vivian found herself sitting beside Renee, the 2 of them watching the small gathering with the particular contentment of people who understood, better than most, how rare and hard-won a peaceful evening like this one actually was. You seem different, Renee said quietly. Lighter. I don't think I've seen you like this since we were kids. Vivian considered that for a moment, watching Havoc laugh at something Gus had said, watching Ellie's daughter chase a firefly across the yard with the pure, uncomplicated joy of a child who had no idea what her mother had risked to make a moment like this possible. I think, Vivian said slowly, I spent 7 years carrying something I thought I had to carry alone. Turns out that was never true. I just hadn't found the people yet who were willing to carry it with me. Renee reached over, squeezed her sister's hand. Dad would be proud of you, she said. Not just for what you did, for letting people in enough to help you do it. Vivian looked out at the small gathering, a mechanic who'd lost everything twice and rebuilt anyway, a young captain who'd risked her career on the strength of a promise made to a man 7 years dead, a fighter pilot working through his own guilt, one Saturday visit at a time, a sister who had never once, in 2 years, asked her to be anything other than exactly what she was. I think he would, she said quietly. I think he'd finally get to stop worrying. The fireflies rose slowly out of the tall grass at the edge of Gus's property as the last light faded from the sky, and for the first time, in longer than she could easily measure, Vivian Marsh sat still, surrounded by people who understood the weight of what she'd carried, and let herself simply exist in a moment that asked nothing more of her than to be present in it. No emergency, no investigation, no 7 years of unanswered questions hanging over everything like a held breath. Just an evening, ordinary, hard-won, and entirely hers. Somewhere, she liked to think, Her father was watching this exact scene, his daughter finally home, finally surrounded, finally at peace, and for once, for the first time in longer than either of them would have guessed possible, there was nothing left unfinished between them. The truth had found its way into the light, and everyone she loved most in the world had found their way, slowly and imperfectly and completely worth it, into a single warm evening that neither grief nor corruption nor 7 years of silence had ever managed to take from her. That she understood now, watching the fireflies climb toward a darkening sky, was what her father had actually been trying to protect all along. Not just the truth. The people who remained standing once the truth finally arrived.